So a while ago, I saw a comment that went like this. I just finished playing Path of Radiance and looked online at the tier list to see how my favorite units ranked, and I saw Nephany was near the bottom and I was very surprised. My Nephany destroyed everything. Sure, I had to train her a bit, but once she was online, she kicked ass, dodging and killing everything, and she could tank a hit too. Did I just get lucky? It made me kinda sad that a unit I liked is considered low tier. And I've seen this kind of comment made a lot, people feeling bad because a tier list ranks their favorites low. That sucks. Now, I've made a lot of Fire Emblem tier lists in the past, but I never really made a meta video about Fire Emblem tier lists, about tier lists as a concept. What's a tier list for? What does it mean if a tier list puts a unit somewhere? What's a tier? What's a tier gap? These are topics I may have touched upon in the past, but never something I took the time to dive into. Usually because when I'm making tier lists, I wanna, well, make the lists, place the units. But not today. Today we're gonna get into the nitty gritty of what a tier list is, or at least what it is to me and to a lot of people who make them. And perhaps more importantly, about what they're not, and why they're often so different from how people experience Fire Emblem units. And not in the way that you might expect. If you're a long-time fan of these discussions, you might think I'm gonna start talking about defining things like efficiency, or turn saves, or why we're playing on harder difficulties, or perhaps the laws of supply and demand. But today, I'd like to do things a little differently. I've given those explanations in the past, and I still partially agree with them, but they have a big flaw. They don't seem to really connect with the people that I'd like them to reach, like the writer of that comment at the start of the video. But I think the following one might, so let's give it a go. I'd like to get started by introducing the concept of brownie points, and I promise it's going somewhere. A unit gets brownie points for doing something, or being able to do something that helps the player. They can kill an enemy, brownie points. They can survive an enemy, brownie points. They can visit a village or open a chest to give you a good item, brownie points. They can rescue, shove, rally, or in any other way you can think of, support one of your other units, brownie points. You get the idea. Everything a unit can possibly do to help, they get brownie points. It's a very happy, positive way to get started on rating units. Brownie points is apparently a known expression in the English language, but I'd never heard of it when I first saw it in the context of a Fire Emblem discussion. I borrowed it from a person who used to frequent the Fire Emblem tier list threads on GameFAQs and Cern's Forest messaging boards. Well, to be exact, I think they used the phrase exactly once in a discussion, saying something like, Mia deserves brownie points for doing this one thing, and it's somehow stuck with me ever since. Their name was Interceptor, if you were around back then, and they always had the most colorful way to describe the most mundane things. They had the Final Fantasy character Interceptor as their avatar, and that is why there is a dog next to dogA here. A very important part of brownie points is that we only give them out for things a unit can do, not for things they have. This unit has 30 base strength, well that's cool, but what does it let them do? This unit caps all their stats at the end of the game. That's very satisfying, but what utility does that provide? Usually the answer to that question is like, it lets them kill enemies, or it lets them survive this particular area if all the enemies attack them. But the most important part is that we translate what a unit's stat screen says to the actual utility those numbers provide, before we move on to the next step. Speaking of which, so now we've given all our hypothetical units brownie points for everything they can possibly do in the game. Every unit is going to have a good amount because you can earn some for everything you do. But not every unit can do everything. Units that join earlier can do things that units that join later do not. Like, not every unit can kill an enemy in the first chapter. Not every unit can move far away and secure objectives. Not every unit can do rallying or healing or rescuing to support your other units. So those unique things will cause an uneven distribution of points. There will also be things that pretty much all your units can do. The weak enemies in that late game chapter of Sacred Stones, they can be killed by Marissa or Amelia or Ewan, but they can also be killed by pretty much the entire cast. They are weak, and our units at this point are at their strongest and have access to the legendary weapons with effective damage on them. Amelia and company still get brownie points for this, but so does everyone else. Now imagine we sort all units in the game by how many brownie points they have. Units that can only do things that almost anyone can do will be at the bottom of such a list, while units that can do things few others can do will float to the top. If your unit can kill enemies after a round of training in the Tower of Valny, or sweep up hordes of enemies in the late game, or kill the Demon King, they're still getting credit for it, but only as much credit as every other unit is. But if your unit is doing more unique things like healing or dancing or flying or performing notably better at combat than their peers, they will get points that others are missing out on. And from this, we get a list that should somewhat resemble what a common FEA tier list looks like, at least in terms of how the units are ordered. And the nice thing about this system is that it also incorporates a pretty nebulous subject in tiering that tends to feel pretty counterintuitive to people looking at their first Fire Emblem tier list: availability. If you're not around, you can't get Brownie points. So Seth and Erica start with a Brownie point leads over other units, and if those other units want to surpass Seth and Erica, they'll have to work a little bit harder. The system is counting every single thing they do, so if you're around longer to do more things, you get more points. Of course, in a specific case of Sacred Stones, it's not very feasible for any units to do what Seth does in a shorter period of time, but when competing against Erica, there is some hope since she tends to lose steam fast in the mid-game. There is one thing that the system does not factor in yet: tier gaps, also known as the divide between tiers, and I'm so glad to finally have an excuse to talk about this, and that the Brownie point system makes it a lot easier to explain. I think there are, broadly speaking, two ways to do tier gaps. Method 1, every tier encompasses a range of Brownie points. Say the most Brownie points anyone can ever get is 1000, so then S tier is for units with 1000 points, A tier for those in the 900 to 999 range, B is for units with 800 to 899, and so on. That way, every unit can be sorted into the tier they fit in. I think this is the method that makes the most sense through the Brownie point lens, but it completely forgoes a crucial aspect of tiering, which is the tier gaps. Tier gaps are actually the most important and most controversial part of any tier list. It sounds stupid, but hear me out. If anyone has an issue with a tier list, it's usually that a unit is in the wrong tier. Just listen to these, they are pretty common objections to any tier list. How is Felicia in A tier? She's like B tier at best. How is Bernadetta a whole tier above Lysithea? What is Astrid doing in B tier? She is amazing, she should be in A. And what do you mean Nephany is D tier? She was good in my playthrough. All of these very common criticisms are mostly about which tier a unit is in. This implies that there's a big difference between the tiers. A unit in A tier is much better than a unit in B tier, and a unit in B tier is much better than a unit in C tier, and so on. Unit at the bottom of B tier should be much better than the unit at the top of C tier. So the unit at the bottom of B tier cannot possibly be 1 point away from the unit at the top of C. So any method that sorts unit like that doesn't do a tier list justice. So method 2 theoretically would look more like this. Units with 1000 points still go in S tier, then there's a tier gap of about 100 points, and an A tier is something like all units between 800 and 899. Then there's, say, a tier gap of 50 points, followed by B tier for units between 700 and 750, and so on. As weird as that sounds, that is the only method that fits tier lists as they're interpreted by most people. It does imply that there are no units that fit these tier gaps, although maybe this is a good explanation for what people say about some units that they think could fit in two different tiers. You know, when someone's like, I think they're either a low A or a high B. That could be units with point totals that fall right in those tier gaps. Of course, no one's actually mapped out all the possible Brownie points. There are too many things that could give out Brownie points and never actually went into how many Brownie points a unit gets for something. Surely killing a Chapter 1 bandit is not worth the same amount of Brownie points as being able to kill a Chapter 17 boss or whatever. This whole Brownie points thing wasn't meant to be a solution to solve all tier list debates ever, or a way to quantify every unit ever in an objective way. I just think it's a better way to explain the decision making behind tier lists than most other ones I've seen so far, even if that process might be subconscious for people making tier lists. A tier list is sometimes called a viability ranking, which I think is not the best description for them, the way what we Fire Emblem veterans make them. After all, almost every unit is viable. Some units are more viable than others in the sense that they're more available or more easy to train, or they don't have to train at all, but in the end, viability is by most people thought of as mostly binary. A unit is viable or they're not viable. And I used this unit and they were good, so they must be viable, so why are they ranked so low on a viability ranking? Because everyone else was also viable, but their favorite Nephany or Amelia or Nino takes more player input to make viable. And when I say player input, I don't mean more physical inputs like more button presses. I mean more thinking, more caution, more grinding, and or more planning by the player. What I think tier lists are, more than viability rankings or viability binary switches, is discussion vehicles. Every unit placement is a sum of a unit's pros and cons, and often those are long lists of pros and cons. These lists are worth having long discussions about and can provide cool insights into how we look at and evaluate units and their utility. But just a single placement on a tier list is very bad at conveying a sum of things, especially pros and cons, because those things tend to cancel each other out. Tier lists are extremely bad at conveying the difference between a unit with high highs and low lows and a unit that's just very average all around. They're also very bad at telling you if a unit is worth deploying, which is not surprisingly what a lot of people look at tier lists for. We sometimes put units that are really good somewhere around the middle, just because they didn't have enough brownie points built up over the course of the game. If you have a growth unit from the early game that's really good, say Franz, and you have to compare them to the unit from the mid game that's also really good, like Dussel or Garrick, the tier list might tell you that the units are about equal, or even that the early game unit is better. But there are a lot of realistic scenarios where that ranking is completely wrong, like if Franz is underleveled, RNG screwed, or even completely untrained. If you look at just a farmland tier list for any reason, without any explanation behind them, chances are they're not useful to you. They tell you nothing except that whoever made the list thinks that one character is, overall, better than another character. Because a tier list is not a guide to anything. It is basically just all of one person's opinions on everything about every unit thrown into a blender. Or in the case of tier lists made by a group of people, it's multiple people's opinions, which makes them even more difficult to interpret. That doesn't make them entirely useless, but it does create a chasm between the people making the tier lists and the people trying to read them and use them for something they were not made for. And it's not too hard to make something useful for these people that isn't a tier list but sure looks a lot like one. And while you're at it, you can give the tiers more useful and descriptive names, which can also eliminate a lot of complications, like comparing dancers to healers to combat units, for instance. These methods of ranking units can exist alongside each other, as long as the makers clearly communicate what their list is and is not trying to do. This is something that I've been trying to do in the past that I think I usually do well. I've got my character guide videos and my tier list videos, and it's easy to tell them apart. And now I've got this video that hopefully further outlines the difference that you can link to. I don't know if the people who didn't already know all this are going to watch this whole video and pay enough attention to retain all the info, but hey, you did, so thank you, and I'll see you next time.